The rain began before dawn, falling in silvery threads across the steep mountain village where the Duke's wife had spent the last peaceful years of her life. Mist drifted between the pines, softening the outlines of cottages and stone walls, while distant church bells sounded through the valley like mournful echoes from another world. Within a modest manor overlooking the cliffs, a young woman stood beside a tall window, watching the storm gather over the horizon. One hand rested gently upon the shoulder of her small son. The other pressed against the cool glass as though she could hold back the future itself. She was a duchess by marriage, yet little in her surroundings reflected rank or privilege. Exile had taught her simplicity. Grace had taught her endurance. Though still young, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned that love often demanded sacrifice. Her dark hair was arranged neatly beneath a lace cap, and her pale blue gown glowed softly in the gray morning light. Anyone who looked upon her would have seen composure. Only those who knew her heart would have recognized the fear hidden beneath it. That fear had a name. For 4 months, troubling reports had arrived from the Duke's homeland. Noble houses once loyal to the crown had become restless. Powerful rivals gathered support in secret. Rumors traveled farther and faster than official messages, and each rumor carried the scent of approaching disaster. The Duchess had listened to every letter being read aloud, every whispered conversation cut short when she entered a room. She understood far more than anyone realized. Behind her, the door opened. The Duke entered quietly, yet the room seemed to change around him. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed for travel, he carried the natural authority of a man born to command. Rainwater darkened the edges of his cloak. His sword hung at his side, polished and familiar. To strangers he appeared fearless. To his wife he looked tired. Their son rushed forward immediately. "Father." The Duke smiled, kneeling to gather the boy into his arms. "There is my brave little soldier." "I am not a soldier," the child protested. "Mother says I must first learn my letters." The Duke laughed, and for a moment the shadows hanging over the household seemed to retreat. "A wise instruction," he replied. "Kings may command armies, but men who cannot read often lose their kingdoms." The Duchess watched them together, her heart tightening with affection and unease. She had always loved this sight, father and son sharing laughter while the world remained safely outside their door. Yet today the world was waiting at the threshold. The Duke rose and crossed the room toward her. "You have not slept," he said softly. "Neither have you." His smile faded. "No." For several moments neither spoke. The silence between them carried years of devotion and 1,000 unspoken worries. Beyond the window, thunder rolled across the mountains. At last the Duchess lowered her gaze. "Must you go?" The question was simple. The answer was not. "If I remain here, I abandon my people," he said. "If I return, there is still a chance to prevent bloodshed." "A chance," she repeated. "A chance is enough." She wanted to argue. She wanted to beg him to stay. She wanted, for one selfish moment, to place her family above duty and crown. Yet she had not fallen in love with an ordinary man. She had fallen in love with a man whose sense of honor ruled him as completely as any king ruled a nation. So instead she asked, "And if peace cannot be preserved?" The Duke looked toward the distant horizon. "Then I shall fight." The words settled heavily between them. Their son, sensing the seriousness he could not fully understand, stepped closer and slipped his small hand into his father's. "When will you come back?" The Duke immediately turned toward him. "Very soon." "How soon?" "Soon enough that you will barely have time to miss me." The boy appeared satisfied. The Duchess did not. She knew promises made before departures possessed a fragile beauty. They were often sincere. They were not always fulfilled. The morning passed too quickly. Servants loaded supplies into waiting carriages. Horses stamped impatiently in the courtyard. The rain strengthened, drumming against rooftops and cobblestones. Every sound seemed to count down the final moments before separation. When the hour arrived, the family stood beneath the manor's stone archway. The Duke fastened a silver pendant around his son's neck. "So you remember that I am always with you." Then he turned to his wife. For an instant the storm disappeared. The servants disappeared. Even the kingdom waiting beyond the mountains disappeared. There was only the woman he loved. He reached for her gloved hand and pressed it between both of his. "No force upon this earth could keep me from returning to you." Emotion flickered across her face. "You must not make promises to fate." "I am making a promise to you." His voice was steady, magnetic, impossible not to believe. The Duchess felt tears threaten her composure. She swallowed them back. She would not burden his departure with visible grief. Instead she stepped forward and kissed his cheek. Then return safely, your grace. Always. The carriage door closed. The horses began to move. Slowly, the Duke disappeared through sheets of rain, descending the winding road that led toward the kingdom he hoped to save. His son waved until the carriage became a blur. The Duchess remained motionless beneath the archway long after it vanished completely. A strange chill settled over her despite the warmth of her cloak. Deep within her heart, where reason could not reach, an unbearable certainty began to grow. Above the mountains, unseen enemies were already moving toward war. She did not yet know that this farewell would become the dividing line between two lives, the life she had known, and the life fate was already preparing to steal away. The journey to the kingdom lasted several days, yet with every mile the Duke traveled, his unease deepened. The mountains gradually surrendered to rolling valleys, and the valleys gave way to vast plains where villages should have been bustling with commerce and harvest celebrations. Instead, silence lingered over the countryside like a gathering storm. Farmers paused in their work to watch his procession pass. Travelers lowered their eyes. Even roadside inns seemed unnaturally quiet. It was as though the entire realm were holding its breath. By the time the towers of the capital appeared on the horizon, the Duke knew the reports he had received had not exaggerated the danger. They had underestimated it. Black smoke curled upward from distant districts. Armed patrols moved through roads that should have been crowded with merchants and nobles. Several banners flying above strategic fortifications were no longer those of loyal houses. Men he had trusted since childhood had already chosen new allegiances. His horse slowed as he stared at the sight before him. A kingdom was not lost in a single day. It was lost through countless acts of cowardice, greed, and betrayal. One of his commanders rode beside him. "Your Grace," the man said quietly, "we still have supporters within the city." The Duke continued studying the skyline. "How many?" The commander hesitated. The silence provided the answer. "Not enough." By sunset, emergency councils filled the palace. Maps covered long oak tables. Messengers arrived breathless from distant provinces. Loyal nobles argued over strategies while frightened servants hurried through corridors carrying reports of fresh uprisings. The Duke listened to every voice. Some advised negotiation. Others demanded immediate retaliation. Many simply sought to protect their own fortunes. Yet beneath every recommendation lay the same terrible truth. The enemy had moved faster than anyone expected. For months they had secretly purchased loyalties. For months they had manipulated rival families. For months they had prepared for war while the kingdom convinced itself peace would endure. Now the illusion had shattered. Late that night, after the final advisor departed, the Duke stood alone upon a balcony overlooking the capital. Thousands of lanterns glimmered below like scattered stars. Normally the sight filled him with pride. Tonight it filled him with responsibility. Somewhere beyond those lights, families slept believing their rulers would protect them. He thought of his wife. He thought of his son. For a brief moment he considered abandoning everything. He could leave before dawn. He could return to the mountains. He could choose love over duty. The temptation lasted only seconds. Then he straightened his shoulders. A man might flee from danger. A duke could not. The first battles erupted within a week. Enemy forces seized several strongholds along the northern frontier. Supply routes were attacked. Garrisons changed sides. Towns that had once sworn loyalty to the crown suddenly welcomed rival banners. The conflict spread like wildfire across dry grass. The Duke rode constantly. One day he negotiated with uncertain nobles. The next he inspected defensive positions. Then he was leading cavalry charges through fields drenched in rain and blood. Sleep became a luxury. Peace became a memory. Yet wherever he appeared, morale improved. Soldiers fought harder beneath his command. Citizens cheered when they saw him ride through their streets. Even men who feared defeat drew strength from his presence. He never asked others to face dangers he would not face himself. That loyalty became both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. Because while he inspired devotion, his enemies possessed numbers. And numbers were relentless. Winter arrived early that year. Snow covered battlefields before the dead could be buried. Frozen winds howled across valleys littered with broken weapons and shattered dreams. Entire villages became prisons of fear, trapped between advancing armies. Still the Duke refused to surrender. One bitter evening, his generals gathered around a fire inside a temporary command tent. "We must retreat," one urged. "If we retreat further, the capital falls," another argued. "The capital will fall regardless if our army is destroyed." The Duke remained silent. Finally he spoke. If we abandon the field now, every sacrifice already made becomes meaningless. The tent fell quiet. No one challenged him. Not because they believed victory was certain, but because they understood the kind of man he was. Honor often demanded impossible choices, and he had always chosen honor. The decisive battle came beneath a sky the color of iron. Two armies faced one another across a vast frozen plain. Thousands of soldiers stood motionless as snow drifted through the air. Trumpets echoed across the landscape. Banners snapped violently in the wind. The Duke sat astride his horse at the front of his cavalry. His armor gleamed despite the storm. His expression remained calm. Yet deep within his heart lived a single regret. He had not kept his promise. He had told his wife he would return soon. Instead he had sent only letters. Letters filled with reassurances. Letters filled with hope. Letters that concealed how desperate the situation had become. The battle began with thunder. Cannons roared. Arrows darkened the sky. Men surged forward screaming the names of kings, families, and causes they believed worth dying for. Chaos swallowed the world. Hours passed in a blur of steel and smoke. The Duke fought with extraordinary courage. Again and again he led counterattacks. Again and again he pushed back overwhelming odds. Yet bravery could not alter reality. His army was being crushed. One commander fell. Then another. Entire formations disappeared beneath relentless assaults. The frozen ground turned crimson. Still he refused to retreat. Near sunset, surrounded by enemies, he continued fighting long after hope should have vanished. A sword struck his shoulder. Another cut across his side. His horse collapsed beneath him. Pain exploded through his body. Yet somehow he rose again. Snow mixed with blood on his face. His vision blurred. The sounds of battle faded into distant echoes. Then came the final blow. A powerful strike knocked him to the ground. The sky spun overhead. Dark clouds drifted across the dying light. For the first time he realized he might never see his wife and son again. The thought hurt far more than any wound. As consciousness slipped away he imagined the mountain village. He imagined his son's laughter. He imagined his wife's gentle eyes waiting at the window. Around him, the kingdom he had sacrificed everything to save collapsed beneath the weight of defeat. Nearby, enemy banners rose through the snowfall while loyal soldiers died defending a lost cause. The Duke tried to stand one final time but could not move. Darkness closed around him like a heavy curtain, and the last thing he saw was a lone rider breaking through the chaos, racing desperately toward him through the storm. The rider who broke through the storm was not an enemy but one of the Duke's oldest friends, a nobleman named Arthur, who had fought beside him since youth. He carried the unconscious Duke from the battlefield under cover of darkness while arrows hissed through the snow. Several loyal soldiers sacrificed themselves to secure their escape, and by dawn the small group had vanished into forests beyond enemy lines. Behind them the kingdom burned. Ahead lay uncertainty, exhaustion, grief, and a desperate hope that the Duke might survive his terrible wounds long enough to see another sunrise at least again. Arthur brought him to a secluded estate hidden among rolling hills far from the roads patrolled by occupying forces. The manor belonged to Arthur's widowed sister, and its stone walls offered safety where armies could not easily reach them. 4 days physicians moved quietly through dim corridors carrying medicines, linens, and prayers. The Duke drifted between consciousness and fever, speaking fragments of forgotten battles, unfinished orders, and tender promises meant for his wife. Sometimes he whispered her name with such aching devotion that even hardened servants lowered their eyes in sorrow, unable to witness so much love and pain together. Weeks passed before danger loosened its grip. Winter storms battered the countryside, yet warmth slowly returned to the Duke's body. When he finally rose from bed without assistance, the effort left him trembling, but it also reminded everyone that his spirit remained unbroken. Each morning he demanded reports about the kingdom. Each evening he studied maps despite exhaustion. Defeat wounded his pride, yet concern for his family wounded him more deeply. No messenger had arrived from the mountain village. No letter carried news of his wife or son. The silence grew heavier with every passing day. During this period another presence became increasingly important within the household. Her name was Isabella. Beautiful, elegant, and seemingly compassionate, she was the daughter of a wealthy landowner whose estates bordered Arthur's property. She visited frequently, bringing flowers, books, and small comforts intended to brighten the Duke's recovery. Her dark eyes reflected sympathy whenever she listened to his worries. Her voice carried a soothing gentleness capable of calming even restless thoughts. To observers she appeared devoted. She sat beside his chair during long afternoons, listened attentively to his concerns, and encouraged him whenever despair threatened to overwhelm him. The Duke gradually came to trust her. That trust developed not from passion but from gratitude. He had lost a kingdom, an army, and nearly his life. In such circumstances simple kindness felt precious. Isabella seemed to understand this. She never demanded attention. She never appeared impatient. Instead she offered quiet companionship. When he struggled to lift a cup because of lingering weakness, she helped him without drawing attention to his embarrassment. When nightmares dragged him awake, she reassured him that recovery required time. Every gesture appeared thoughtful. Every word seemed sincere. Yet appearances often concealed dangerous truths. Unknown to the Duke, Isabella measured every interaction according to advantage. She admired power more than character and security more than affection. Before the war she had been fascinated by his title, influence, and vast wealth. Even after his defeat she remained convinced that fortune might someday return to him. For that reason she maintained her performance with remarkable discipline. She learned which memories softened his expression and which topics deepened his trust. Whenever he spoke about his wife, she listened politely while silently calculating possibilities. Compassion decorated her actions, but ambition guided them. The difference remained invisible to him. One evening, as rain tapped softly against tall windows, the Duke sat beside a fire reading old correspondence. Most letters concerned military matters, yet among them rested a note written by his wife years earlier. The paper had faded slightly, but her handwriting remained graceful. He traced the familiar words with his fingertips. Isabella entered quietly and noticed the change in his expression. For the first time since arriving at the estate, genuine happiness touched his features. It lasted only moments, yet she understood immediately that another woman still occupied the deepest chambers of his heart. "Do you miss her greatly?" Isabella asked. The Duke looked up from the letter. "Every hour." There was no hesitation in his answer. "She must be remarkable," Isabella replied. "She is stronger than anyone I have ever known." The certainty in his voice stirred something sharp inside her. Not love. Not jealousy in its purest form. Rather resentment. She had devoted months to earning his confidence, yet a woman hundreds of miles away still held a place she could not approach. The realization unsettled her. From that evening onward, she became determined to secure a greater influence over his future. She smiled as before, spoke kindly as before, and concealed every selfish intention behind perfect manners. Spring approached at last, bringing green fields where snow had once dominated the landscape. The Duke's strength returned steadily. He began discussing plans to rebuild alliances and reclaim portions of the kingdom. Hope, though fragile, reappeared. Arthur welcomed the change, believing recovery had finally overcome despair. Then one afternoon a messenger arrived carrying urgent news from the occupied capital. The rider's horse collapsed from exhaustion in the courtyard. Mud covered the man's cloak. Fear haunted his face. As servants rushed to admit him inside, the Duke rose from his chair, sensing that fate had not finished testing him yet. Within minutes the messenger stood before the gathered household struggling to catch his breath. Arthur broke the seal upon the dispatch and read silently. At first his expression remained controlled. Then all color drained from his face. The Duke noticed immediately and stepped forward. "What news?" Arthur hesitated a moment before answering. "My lord, the report concerns the royal palace. The enemy has crowned a new king and claims complete authority over the realm." A heavy silence followed. Those words confirmed the nightmare he had fought to prevent. Yet hidden beneath that catastrophe waited a darker revelation. The spring that followed the Duke's recovery should have brought renewal. Green fields returned to the countryside. Wildflowers appeared along forgotten roads. Birds filled the morning air with song. Yet within the Duke's heart, winter remained unbroken. Each sunrise reminded him of everything he had lost. His kingdom belonged to another king. His army had been destroyed. His people suffered beneath foreign rule. And far away, beyond mountains and uncertainty, his wife and son remained silent. That silence haunted him more than defeat. While Arthur encouraged him to rebuild alliances, the Duke found himself staring often toward the northern horizon. He imagined his wife standing beside the cottage window where he had last seen her. He imagined his son growing taller with every passing season. These thoughts became both comfort and torment. One evening, while reviewing maps inside Arthur's library, he paused unexpectedly. "I should have gone back sooner." Arthur looked up. "You were dying." "I know. You could barely stand." The Duke lowered his gaze. "Yet they were waiting for me." Arthur said nothing. There were no words capable of easing such regret. Across the room, Isabella listened quietly. Her expression remained gentle, sympathetic, perfectly composed. Yet inwardly she watched every crack forming within the Duke's spirit. She understood something Arthur did not. Hope was the only force keeping him connected to his past. Destroy that hope and he would become a different man entirely. For several weeks she continued cultivating his trust. She accompanied him during walks through the estate gardens. She listened attentively when he spoke about rebuilding the kingdom. She offered encouragement whenever despair threatened to overwhelm him. To outsiders, her devotion appeared admirable. To Isabella it was strategy. Every smile carried purpose. Every kind word concealed calculation. Meanwhile, troubling reports continued arriving from the occupied kingdom. Noble families who resisted the new king vanished mysteriously. Loyal commanders were imprisoned. Entire estates were confiscated. The Duke studied every report with growing frustration. He wanted to fight. He wanted to reclaim everything stolen from him. Yet he lacked soldiers, resources, and allies. For the first time in his life he felt powerless. And powerlessness frightened him. One rainy afternoon, a rider arrived from the capital carrying sealed correspondence. The messenger requested a private audience. Within the hour, Arthur, the Duke, and Isabella gathered in the study. The rider delivered several documents before departing. Arthur opened them first. As he read, concern darkened his features. "What is it?" the Duke asked. Arthur hesitated. Then he handed over the papers. The documents confirmed what many had feared. The enemy king had officially consolidated control of the realm. Remaining loyalists had either surrendered or disappeared. The resistance was collapsing. The Duke read every page in silence. When he finally looked up, something had changed in his eyes. Not anger. Not sorrow. Something colder. Acceptance. The realization that an entire chapter of his life had ended. "The kingdom is lost," he said quietly. Arthur immediately objected. "No kingdom is lost forever. Perhaps. You can still rebuild." The Duke stared toward the rain-covered window. "Can I?" The question lingered unanswered. That night, Isabella visited him alone. She found him seated beside a fire, surrounded by maps and letters. Most were old. Many came from his wife. He had preserved every one. Even now, years later, he occasionally reread them. The sight irritated Isabella more than she cared to admit. A dead woman still occupied his heart. Or rather, a woman he believed dead. "My lord," she said softly. He looked up. "You should rest." "I am tired of resting." "Then allow yourself peace." A bitter smile touched his lips. "Peace abandoned me long ago." For several moments neither spoke. Then Isabella carefully approached. "What if some losses cannot be repaired?" The Duke studied the flames. "I know that." "What if holding on to the past only deepens your suffering?" Her voice remained gentle. Persuasive. Dangerously gentle. The Duke closed his eyes. "If I release the past, I release them." The answer stunned even Isabella. For the first time she realized the depth of his devotion. 5 years of marriage. Years of separation. Years of uncertainty. And still he loved his wife with unwavering loyalty. A lesser woman might have admired such devotion. Isabella resented it, because she could not compete with it. The following week brought devastating news. A group of refugees arrived from the northern territories. Among them were travelers who claimed to have witnessed enemy raids near the mountain village where the Duchess had lived. Their stories were fragmented, confused, filled with fear. Yet Isabella recognized opportunity. Over several days she quietly gathered every rumor, every uncertain account, every tragic detail. Then she shaped them into something far more dangerous. A believable lie. When the moment finally arrived, she delivered it with remarkable skill. The Duke, Arthur, and several servants were present when she entered the room carrying a bundle of reports. Her face appeared pale. Her hands trembled slightly. "My lord," she whispered. The Duke immediately sensed trouble. "What happened?" She lowered her gaze. "There has been news from the mountains." Every muscle in his body stiffened. Arthur exchanged a wary glance with her. "What kind of news?" The answer came slowly, painfully. As the enemy expanded its campaign, several villages were attacked. The Duke rose from his chair. "The village?" Isabella nodded. Silence filled the room. Then came the words that would alter everything. "They found your wife." The Duke's breathing stopped. "And my son." Tears appeared in Isabella's eyes. Perfectly timed tears. "I am so sorry." The room seemed to tilt. Arthur immediately stepped forward. "These are only reports." But the Duke no longer heard him. He stared at Isabella, searching desperately for uncertainty, for hesitation, for hope. He found none. Only sorrow. Carefully manufactured sorrow. A devastating stillness settled over him. Months of endurance. Months of hope. Months of believing he would see them again. All shattered in a single moment. The fire crackled softly. Rain struck the windows. No one dared move. Finally the Duke spoke. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Then heaven has taken everything from me." Those words broke something inside him. Arthur saw it. Even Isabella saw it. The proud ruler who had survived war, betrayal, exile, and near death suddenly looked older. Not physically, spiritually, like a man carrying grief too heavy for any human heart. Yet beneath the crushing weight of despair, one final spark remained alive. A desperate need to know the truth for himself. That very night, before dawn touched the horizon, the Duke saddled his horse and prepared to ride north toward the mountain village. Arthur tried to stop him. Servants begged him to wait. His wounds had not fully healed. The journey would be dangerous. None of it mattered. If his wife and son truly lay beneath the earth, he would stand beside their graves. If even the smallest chance remained that they lived, he would find it. As thunder rolled across the dark sky, he rode into the storm alone, unaware that destiny was leading him toward the greatest deception of his life, and toward a secret hidden within a single unopened letter. For 5 years, the Duke lived as a ghost wandering through a world that no longer felt his own. He abandoned titles, estates, and ambitions. The man who had once commanded armies now traveled under assumed names, moving from town to town with little more than a horse, a cloak, and memories that refused to fade. Wherever he went, people saw a quiet gentleman marked by sorrow, but none recognized the fallen ruler hidden beneath the years. Time softened many wounds. His did not soften. They deepened. Every spring reminded him of promises broken by fate. Every winter reminded him of the night he had believed his family lost forever. He rarely spoke of the past, yet he carried it constantly. Some evenings he would sit alone beside an fire, staring into the flames as though searching for faces he could no longer touch. Yet far beyond the sea, another heart remained faithful. The Duchess had survived. So had their son. The years abroad had not been easy. She had endured hardship, uncertainty, and loneliness. There were nights when fear whispered that her husband might never return. There were mornings when hope seemed foolish. Still she waited. The promise written in her letter had never changed. 5 years. When those 5 years ended, she would return. And so she did. The ship carrying her home crossed gray waters beneath a pale autumn sky. Standing upon the deck, she watched the distant coastline emerge through the mist. Beside her stood a young boy no longer small enough to hold her hand constantly. He had become intelligent, thoughtful, and remarkably similar to the father he barely remembered. "Mother," he asked quietly, "do you think he is still alive?" The question pierced her heart. For years she had asked herself the same thing. "Yes," she answered. The certainty in her voice surprised even her. "I believe he is." The boy nodded. He wanted to believe it too. When they finally arrived in the kingdom, neither recognized what they found. The realm had changed. New banners flew above government buildings. Old alliances had vanished. Many people spoke of the Duke as though he belonged to history. Some believed he had died. Others believed he had fled forever. The Duchess listened to every rumor with growing concern. Something was wrong. If her husband had survived the war, why had he never come for them? Why had he never answered her letter? That question haunted her. Within weeks she began searching. The search eventually led her to Arthur. Older now, wearier now, but still honorable. When he opened the door and saw her standing there, he froze. For several seconds he could not speak. "You." Tears immediately filled his eyes. "My lady." The Duchess understood at once. Arthur had believed her dead. Just as the Duke had. The terrible realization settled between them. Someone had lied. Someone had separated them. Someone had stolen 5 years. That evening Arthur revealed everything he knew. The false reports. The journey to the village. The Duke's despair. His disappearance. The Duchess listened in stunned silence. Then Arthur mentioned Isabella. A shadow crossed his expression. "The letter," he said slowly. "What letter?" "The letter you left for him." The Duchess felt her pulse quicken. "Yes." "He never received it." The room became utterly still. Arthur stared toward the fire. For years he had dismissed his suspicions as grief and imagination. Now they returned with devastating clarity. The last person known to possess it was Isabella. The Duchess closed her eyes. At last the truth emerged. Not fate. Not war. Not distance. Deception. A single act of selfishness had stolen half a decade from their lives. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the Duke arrived in a small mountain town shortly before winter. He intended only to stay one night. Instead, destiny waited there. The town square bustled with merchants and travelers preparing for snowfall. Children ran between market stalls. Musicians played near a fountain. The Duke walked through the crowd without interest. Then he heard laughter. A boy's laughter. Something about it felt strangely familiar. He turned. Across the square stood a young boy speaking animatedly with a bookseller. The child's posture, the shape of his face, even the way he tilted his head while listening. The resemblance struck like lightning. The Duke stopped breathing. Impossible. Yet he could not look away. The boy glanced up. Their eyes met. For one bewildering moment both stood motionless. The Duke felt an emotion he could not explain. Recognition. Not from memory. From blood. Before he could move, a woman stepped from a nearby shop. The world seemed to stop. 5 years vanished. 5 years of grief. 5 years of loneliness. 5 years of unanswered questions. She stood exactly where the crowd parted. Older. Wiser. Yet unmistakably the same woman he had loved. The Duchess. A basket slipped from her hands. Apples scattered across the cobblestones. Neither noticed. The boy looked between them in confusion. The Duke stared as though afraid she might disappear. The Duchess pressed trembling fingers against her lips. Tears filled her eyes. No, he whispered. It was the same word he had spoken when told she was dead. But this time it carried hope instead of despair. She took a step forward. Then another. The crowd around them faded into irrelevance. Only 3 people existed. A husband. A wife. A son. You're alive, the Duke said. The Duchess laughed through tears. So are you. Neither could move quickly enough. The distance between them vanished. The Duke wrapped his arms around her as though afraid the years might steal her again. She held him just as tightly. Every sorrow, every misunderstanding, every lonely night seemed to break apart beneath the weight of that embrace. The boy stared in amazement. Then realization dawned. Father? The Duke looked at him. His vision blurred with tears. My son. A moment later the 3 stood together, holding one another while the first snowflakes of winter drifted gently from the sky. The kingdom remained changed. The lost years could never be returned. Yet some victories were greater than crowns. Some miracles were greater than power. And as husband, wife, and son stood reunited beneath the falling snow, they finally understood a truth that war, betrayal, and deception had failed to destroy. Love had waited. Love had endured. And at last, after 5 long years, love had found its way home. Broken Heart crowned Snowflake Scroll Red Heart. This was the second last part of our story. The grand finale is coming in part 5, so stay tuned. I hope you'll enjoy the ending. Thank you for your love and support. I love you all, my amazing viewers. See you soon with a brand new story. Red Heart sparkles.